Welcome to Twisted Roots, where family stories are not polished fairy tales but the raw truths that live in the corners of our homes. If you've ever carried the weight of family sacrifice or felt unseen in your own life, this channel is for you. Please consider subscribing because these are not just my stories, they are our stories. And sometimes, listening to another family's heartbreak can give us the courage to face our own. Title of today's story: My son used my name to impress his investors, so I took the mic and spoke the truth. I was never the kind of man people noticed. I didn't wear expensive watches or step out of shiny cars. My shirts came from clearance racks and my boots carried the stains of years gone by. I was the man who kept the lights on after everyone else went home, the shadow mopping a warehouse floor when the city slept. If you ask people in town who Richard Bell was, most would shrug. To them, I was nobody. To me, I was a father, and that was enough. For decades, I worked in silence. Graveyard shifts, cold mornings, double shifts when bills piled up too high. Every scrape of my hands, every ache in my back was an offering. I thought if I stayed invisible, my son could live visible, confident, ambitious, untouched by the bruises of poverty that shaped me. And in a way, it worked. He grew into a man who walked into rooms I could never enter. Men in suits shook his hand. Women in gowns laughed at his jokes. He owned the kind of smile that made people believe in him, trust him, follow him. I watched from the sidelines, proud and tired. But here's the thing about being invisible: you don't get to control how others use your silence. One night, in a ballroom heavy with chandeliers and the smell of expensive wine, I heard my name, not in a whisper, but in a toast. My son raised his glass, his cufflinks catching the light, and announced to the room, "I give my father $10,000 every month. I make sure he's taken care of." The applause was instant, rolling across the tables like thunder. Strangers turned toward me with admiration in their eyes, as if I were the luckiest father alive. They believed I was living in comfort, my bills paid, my table full, my dignity intact. But I wasn't. That night, when the party ended, I drove home in my rusted Ford that coughed smoke with every mile. I unlocked the door to a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of bleach from the warehouse. In the refrigerator, a half-empty jug of water, an onion, and nothing else. I sat in the silence of that empty kitchen and realized something painful. My son had used my name not to honor me, but to build himself higher. I had become a prop in his story, and props do not speak. But maybe, just maybe, this prop had one last voice left in him. It started small, like all rumors do. At the grocery store, Mrs. Keller from down the street leaned over her cart and said with a smile, "Richard, you're a lucky man. Your boy takes such good care of you. 10,000 a month. I wish my kids were that generous." I blinked at her, caught off guard, holding nothing but a can of beans in my hand. 10,000. Her voice rolled the number like it was common knowledge, like it had been written in the town newspaper. I laughed it off. "You can't believe everything you hear," I said, but she shook her head. "Oh, it wasn't just me. Everyone at the Rotary dinner was talking about it. You must be living like a king." I smiled politely, but the truth was I went home that night to the same bare apartment, the same peeling wallpaper, the same silence. No one in that grocery store aisle would ever guess I was deciding between paying the gas bill or the electric bill. They only saw the story my son had fed them, and the story spread. The mailman lingered a little longer at my box, joking, "With 10 grand a month, maybe you'll give me a raise, huh?" The barber down the block patted my shoulder and said, "Heard about your boy. You raised him right." Even my pastor smiled warmly during service, telling the congregation what a beautiful example of honor between father and son we were. Each word of praise felt like a pebble tossed into my pocket. At first light, but after a while the weight was crushing. Because with every compliment I wanted to scream, "It isn't true. I'm not living on 10,000 a month. I'm still sweeping floors while the world sleeps. My rent eats half my check. My knees ache from bending. My cupboards are nearly empty." But I said nothing. I nodded. I smiled. I played the role of the fortunate father. Silence, after all, had always been my specialty. Yet silence can feel like a betrayal, especially when it's your own. Because every time I let someone believe the lie, I was betraying myself, betraying the years I had carried this family with calloused hands and sleepless nights. And the cruelest part, I began to feel invisible in a new way, not just ignored, but replaced by a counterfeit version of myself, a man who didn't exist, a man living in comfort, draped in the generosity of a son who, in truth, hadn't called me in weeks. I looked at my reflection one night in the bathroom mirror, a tired face, wrinkles etched like road maps across my forehead. Skin browned from years of labor, and I whispered to myself, who are they talking about, because it sure isn't me. The rumor of riches had taken on a life of its own, and like all lies told loudly enough, it was beginning to drown out the truth. But the thing about lies is they can't last forever. Eventually someone asks the question you can't ignore, and for me, that moment was coming faster than I realized. The invitation came on heavy cardstock, the kind that smelled faintly of cologne and ink pressed too deeply into the paper. Bell and Associates, Winter Investor Gala. It wasn't addressed to me directly, it never was, but Michael called a week before and said, "Dad, it'd mean a lot if you came. Just sit at the table, smile, you don't have to say a word." I had learned long ago that when your children ask for something, especially when they rarely ask for anything at all, you say yes. So I ironed my one decent shirt, shined the same pair of shoes I'd worn to weddings and funerals, and arrived at the ballroom. The room glittered with crystal chandeliers and the clink of champagne flutes. Laughter rolled like currency, easy and overflowing. I sat near the back, my chair tucked a little too close to the wall, where no one would notice if I slipped away early. Michael looked every inch the part. Tailored navy suit, tie knotted with precision. Smile polished as if it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. He shook hands, kissed cheeks, moved through the crowd with the grace of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to struggle. When the band paused and the host tapped a glass for attention, Michael stepped forward, his voice carried with the ease of a man used to owning the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate not just numbers and projections, but legacy." I felt the word strike me, legacy. A word I had never claimed for myself, though I had given him mine. He raised his glass higher. "Everything I've built, every milestone reached, I owe to the man sitting right over there, my father." Heads turned toward me, 100 eyes burned into the back corner where I sat, my stomach clenched. Then he said it. "I give my father $10,000 every month. I make sure he's cared for, that he never wants for anything, because that's what family means." The room erupted, applause thundered. People turned to me, nodding, smiling, clapping as if I were a king on a throne. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man across the table mouthed the words, "Good son." And I sat frozen, hands folded in my lap, the calluses on my palms pressing into each other like stones grinding. Because at home, in my refrigerator, sat nothing but a jug of water and an onion. My rent was late. My knees ached from another night shift spent pushing a mop across a warehouse floor. But in that ballroom, I was dressed in wealth that did not exist. Draped in a generosity I had never received. The lie was no longer just a rumor. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling prop. As the applause lingered, Michael turned, smiling at me as if to say, "Play along, Dad, don't ruin this." I forced a smile. It felt like swallowing broken glass. And in that moment I understood something bitter. Sometimes the cruelest wounds aren't delivered in private whispers, but in the applause of a crowd that believes a lie. I smiled for the cameras. That's what I remember most. Not the chandelier light, not the champagne fizzing in crystal glasses, just my own face stretched into a smile that did not belong to me. People clapped, leaned across tables to shake my hand, whispered words like blessed, fortunate, inspiring. They believed my son's speech. They believed every syllable of that fiction, and in their belief, they turned me into someone I was not, a man living off $10,000 a month, pampered by a son's overflowing love. The truth was sitting heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs like a secret begging to break out, but I stayed silent, because in that moment, surrounded by tuxedos and gowns, silence seemed safer than honesty. When the evening ended, I walked out alone. Michael kissed cheeks, shook hands, posed for photographs. His smile gleamed like polished silver. I slipped out the side door unnoticed, clutching the cheap coat I had worn for a decade. Outside, the December air bit at my skin. My old Ford sat in the lot, a cough of smoke puffing from the exhaust when I turned the key. The radio didn't work anymore, so I drove in silence. Neon lights blurred past, restaurants filled with laughter and warm meals. I drove past them all. Toward the one-bedroom apartment that waited like a shadow. The door creaked when I opened it. The air smelled faintly of bleach from the last shift at the warehouse. I flicked the kitchen light. Inside the refrigerator, a half-empty jug of water, an onion, its skin shriveling, 3 cans of beans stacked on the second shelf like soldiers standing guard over nothing. That was my banquet, that was the truth. I sat at the table, the applause from the ballroom still ringing in my ears. My son's words replayed like a cruel joke. I give my father $10,000 every month. 10,000. The number mocked me, because at that exact moment I was counting coins in a jar, deciding whether I could afford both the rent and the heating bill before the new year. I leaned back in my chair, the silence swallowing me whole, and for the first time in years I felt something colder than poverty. It was humiliation. The humiliation of being turned into a lie, and worse, of playing along with it. The world thought I was rich, but the truth was I was starving, and that truth had begun to taste unbearable. I have always believed that words are not the only language people use. Sometimes silence speaks louder. Sometimes an eyebrow lifted or a smile held too long carries more weight than entire speeches. That night in the ballroom where my son's lie became gospel, I noticed Sophia's eyes before I noticed her smile. She was standing just a few feet away, holding a champagne flute as if it were part of her hand, moving through the crowd with the practiced elegance of someone who had long rehearsed her role. But when the applause rose for Michael's toast, when people turned to me with admiration, I caught her gaze. It wasn't pride, it wasn't warmth, it was a warning. Her eyes met mine, sharp, deliberate, steady. The corners of her lips curved upward, but the smile was only for the crowd. For me, there was something else entirely. A message, silent and merciless. Stay quiet. Don't ruin this. If you speak, you'll regret it. That glance was quick, maybe only a second, but a second can be long enough to crush a man. I felt it slide into me like a cold blade. I lowered my eyes, pretending to adjust my cuff, pretending not to understand, but I understood too well, because I had seen that look before, in supervisors who wanted silence about unsafe shifts, in landlords who wanted rent without repairs, in men who owned power and needed the powerless to bow. Sophia's glance told me the lie wasn't just Michael's, it was hers too. She wore it like a gown, shimmering on the surface, heavy with deception underneath. Later, as guests gathered in circles, laughter bubbling like champagne foam, she brushed past me, just a whisper, soft enough that no one else could hear. "It's better for everyone if you let him have this." I froze. The words were sweet in tone, bitter in meaning. Better for everyone. She didn't mean everyone in the room. She meant everyone in her world, her marriage, her image, her investments. And in that moment, humiliation turned into something sharper. Not only was I invisible, but my silence had been claimed as theirs to command. I went home that night with her glance burned into my memory. The jug of water, the onion, the cans of beans, they were no longer just symbols of poverty. They were evidence. Evidence I wasn't supposed to show. Evidence I was warned to keep hidden. Sophia's eyes had told me the rules of their game, but rules only hold until someone decides to break them. And deep down, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years: defiance. Lies have a way of multiplying. At first, they live quietly in the room where they were spoken, but then they slip out the door, hitch a ride on conversations, and by the time they circle back, they wear a dozen different faces. That week, I began to hear my son's boast come back to me, one question at a time. The first came at the barber shop. Old Frank, who had cut my hair for 30 years, leaned in with a grin. "So, Richard, 10 grand a month, huh? Must be nice. You finally get to put your feet up." I laughed too quickly, too nervously. My reply was nothing but a mutter, "Don't believe everything you hear." But he shook his head. "No, no, Michael said it himself at the gala. My nephew was there, said you looked like $1,000,000. $1,000,000. I went home that night and counted the quarters in a glass jar to make sure I had enough for laundry." The next question came from a neighbor, Mrs. Torres. While I was dragging out the trash, she had a scarf wrapped tight around her head, the winter air nipping at our faces. "Your son is so generous," she said warmly. "What do you even do with all that money? Travel, new furniture?" I looked down at the black trash bag in my hands, torn slightly at the corner, a tin can peeking out. Travel, new furniture. I mumbled something about just keeping things simple and hurried back inside before she could ask more. But the questions didn't stop. They dripped one by one from every corner of my small world. At the hardware store, the clerk joked, "Maybe you'll buy us all new drills with that allowance." At church, the pastor clasped my shoulder and said, "Your son is an example to all of us. Honor thy father," right? Even at the library where I went to escape, a man I barely knew nodded respectfully and whispered, "Must feel good to be taken care of, taken care of." That phrase gnawed at me because I wasn't, not in the way they thought, not in the way my son had promised the world. I still worked nights, still limped home on sore knees, still opened a refrigerator that mocked me with its emptiness. But how do you tell people the truth when the lie is so much prettier? How do you stand in the middle of their admiration and confess that you are still poor, still hungry, still invisible? So I did what I had always done. I smiled. I nodded, I answered with half phrases that meant nothing. And every time I did, I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller. My silence was building walls around me, higher and higher, until I could barely breathe. It wasn't just humiliation anymore, it was suffocation. And deep down, a voice I hadn't heard in years began to whisper, "If you don't speak soon, you'll disappear entirely." The warehouse never slept. It breathed in the dark, machines humming, metal doors creaking, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like tired bees. By day, this place moved boxes. By night, it swallowed men, and I was one of them. Every evening after the world believed I was a father living comfortably on $10,000 a month, I put on steel-toed boots with cracked leather, pulled on gloves stiff from old sweat, and walked into the cold. Concrete floor stretched wide and unforgiving. The air inside smelled of dust, oil, and loneliness. My job was simple: mop the floors, stack the pallets, sweep the aisles where forklifts had left trails of dirt. Simple, yes, but not easy. Each push of the mop felt heavier these days. My knees ached, my back stiffened like wood, and sometimes I had to pause, leaning on the handle just to catch my breath. I looked at my hands under the harsh light, skin rough, knuckles swollen. Calluses thick as bark, these were not the hands of a man living in comfort. These were the hands of a man still paying a price no one else could see. Outside those warehouse walls, people pictured me in a leather armchair, sipping whiskey, flipping through travel brochures bought with my son's generosity. That was the image Michael had painted for them. But here I was knees deep in dirty water, scrubbing the concrete as the clock ticked toward dawn. Sometimes I caught myself laughing at the absurdity. A bitter laugh sharp enough to sting. $10,000 a month. If only they could see me here, sweat dripping down my back in the middle of winter, steam rising from my breath while I dragged a mop bucket heavier than my savings account. On breaks, I sat on an overturned crate, eating from a small lunch box, a bologna sandwich, an apple bruised on one side, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee. Other men sat nearby, scrolling on their phones, half asleep, half broken. None of them knew the story being told about me outside these walls. None of them knew I was supposedly the luckiest father in town. I leaned against the wall once, closing my eyes, letting the hum of the machines fill the silence in my chest, and I thought, maybe this is who I really am. Not the father in the stories, not the man in the rumors, just a shadow with a mop. Forgotten by the very son who built his empire on my name. The cold seeped into my bones, and the hours stretched like rubber bands pulled too tight. By the time the shift ended, my legs shook as I walked to the parking lot. The sunrise burned orange across the sky, but it offered no warmth. I slid into my old Ford, started the engine that rattled like a cough, and sat there a moment, staring at my own reflection in the cracked rearview mirror. The lie of the $10,000 was out there, alive and celebrated. The truth of my life was here, in grease-stained gloves and a spine bent from labor. And I knew, as I drove home to an empty fridge, that these two realities could not coexist forever. Something had to break. There comes a moment in every father's life when silence stops being a gift and starts becoming a wound. For years, my silence had been my offering. I had stayed quiet about the bills I couldn't pay, the shifts I couldn't refuse, the dreams I couldn't chase, because I believed my son deserved better than my complaints. Silence was my sacrifice. But now, that same silence had been twisted into something else. It had become the stage upon which Michael built his empire. The lie he fed to investors, the applause he received for generosity that did not exist. And I was the unwilling actor, trapped in a role I never agreed to play. Each day, the questions piled up. Each night, the warehouse floor reminded me who I really was. And in the stillness of my one-bedroom apartment, I began to ask myself a question I had avoided for too long. Do I protect him, or do I protect the truth? It sounds simple, but it wasn't. Because protecting him meant protecting his family, his children, his name, and the community. It meant he could keep walking into rooms where people respected him. And wasn't that what I had always wanted, for my son to be respected, to be seen, to be more than me? But protecting him also meant erasing myself. Every nod, every forced smile, every thank you I whispered to compliments I didn't deserve, it chipped away at who I was. And I wondered, how long can a man live pretending to be someone else? On the other side was the truth. To speak it would be like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. I could already see the flames, investors pulling out, neighbors gossiping, my son's marriage cracking under the weight of exposure. I imagined Michael's face, the anger, the shame. I imagined Sophia's eyes, no longer just warning me but cursing me. But the truth had its own power. It was clean. It was sharp. It was the only thing I still owned in a life that had been stripped bare. I sat one night at my kitchen table, the refrigerator humming behind me, a cold draft sneaking through the cracked window frame. I laid out 2 slips of paper. On one, my bills stacked, overdue. On the other, the invitation to Michael's next investor dinner. 2 lives, 2 versions of me, the father who kept silent or the man who finally spoke. My hand trembled as I pressed my palm against the table, because either choice meant loss. If I stayed silent, I would lose myself. If I spoke, I would lose my son. And between those 2 losses lay the hardest choice of my life. I closed my eyes and whispered into the quiet, "Lord, tell me what matters more, his name or my truth?" The silence gave no answer, only my own heartbeat, heavy and uneven, filling the room. That night I didn't decide, I couldn't, but I knew the moment was coming. A father can only carry someone else's lie for so long before it breaks his back, and mine was already breaking. First banquet had been humiliating. The second felt like a trap. The invitation arrived by courier, tucked inside an envelope with gold lettering, Investor Appreciation Evening hosted by Michael Bell. When I first held it, my instinct was to tear it in half, but then came the phone call, Michael's voice smooth, rehearsed, almost tender. "Dad, I need you there. They love seeing you. You're proof of everything I've said. Just smile, enjoy yourself. It's important." Important, that word clung to me. Important for him, yes, but for me, it meant playing the part of a lie once again. Still, I went. A father always goes. That's the curse and the blessing. The venue this time was larger, grander, a country club with ceilings so high they seemed to mock the sky. Chandeliers dripped light like melted gold. Waiters in black jackets floated between tables carrying trays of lamb chops and champagne. And the investors, men in custom suits. Women in dresses that shimmered like midnight water, gathered in clusters, laughing too loudly, clinking glasses as if money itself was a sound they could toast to. Michael spotted me from across the room. His smile widened instantly, the way a performer brightens when the spotlight hits. He crossed the floor swiftly, placed a firm hand on my shoulder, and guided me toward a table near the front. "Everyone, this is my father," he announced proudly. "The man who taught me everything I know, the reason I work as hard as I do." Applause, nods, glasses raised. I sat down, my chair feeling heavier than any pallet I had ever lifted at the warehouse. Dinner began, course after course, dishes I couldn't pronounce, food that looked more like art than meals. I poked at it, but my stomach was too tight to eat. Around me, investors leaned closer, eyes glowing with curiosity. One of them, a man with a Rolex that flashed under the lights, smiled warmly. "So, Mr. Bell, what do you do with $10,000 a month? Travel, philanthropy?" The table chuckled. They thought it was a charming question. I forced a smile, the same broken glass smile I had worn before. "I live simply," I muttered, my voice barely above the clatter of silverware. "Always have." Another leaned in, a woman with red lipstick that left stains on her glass. "You must be proud." Not many sons take such care of their parents these days. Proud, the word echoed inside me like a hammer on metal. Proud, I was tired, I was humiliated. I was surviving on beans and black coffee while my son built his empire on the illusion of his generosity. The questions kept dripping, one after another, each one a reminder that I was the lie made flesh, paraded as a witness to something that never existed. I glanced at Michael across the table. He was laughing, telling stories, tossing around phrases like legacy, family values, giving back. His cufflinks sparkled, his smile never faltered, and then, like before, I felt her eyes, Sophia's. She sat just 2 seats down, her posture flawless, her face glowing with charm, but her glance found me again. Cold, sharp, a silent command, "Stay quiet." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. The lies were tightening around me like a rope. Each question from the investors pulled the knot tighter, and somewhere deep in my chest I felt it, the breaking point drawing closer. Because a man can only play the part of a ghost for so long, before he decides to speak as the living. The clinking of glasses quieted the room. The host called for a few remarks from Michael, and my son, confident, practiced, rose to his feet. He stood under the chandelier light as if it had been hung there just for him. His suit fit perfectly. His voice carried across the tables with that smooth cadence that made people line in, nodding before they even heard the meaning of his words. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight isn't just about numbers on paper. It's about legacy, about honoring where we come from. It's about family." The word family landed like a stone in my gut. Then he said it again, the line that had become his signature, the line that turned me into a living prop. "I care for my father. I make sure he has everything he needs. I provide him with $10,000 every month because that's what family does." The room erupted. Laughter, applause, toasts raised high, hands clapping, chairs shifting. A thunder of approval. I sat frozen in my seat, the weight of every clap pressing down on my shoulders. The words stabbed sharper this time because they were no longer just a lie. They were a performance polished by repetition, a mantra he had mastered. 10,000, 10,000. The number rang in my head like a cruel joke. At that very moment I could picture my refrigerator, a half-empty jug of water, a shriveled onion, 3 cans of beans. That was my reality. Not this ballroom fantasy. An investor at the table leaned toward me smiling. "You must be the most fortunate father in this room." Fortunate, the word seared. I forced a laugh, but my chest felt tight, my throat dry. My palms pressed against my knees under the table, trying to hold myself steady. Across the table, Sophia's eyes met mine again, sharp, calculating, unblinking. A silent command, "Stay quiet, don't ruin this." But something inside me was cracking. Because in that moment I realized I wasn't just humiliated, I was erased. My life, my labor, my truth, all erased, replaced by a story that fed others admiration while I carried the shame. The applause still thundered, but inside me there was only silence, a silence so loud it hurt. And in that silence I felt it, the snap of something long held down. A man can only carry another's lie for so long before it poisons him. And I had carried this one too far. I looked at Michael, my son, my flesh, my blood, standing tall, smiling, soaking in the praise that wasn't his to claim. And for the first time I knew I would not stay silent anymore. The glass in my hand trembled, my heart pounded. The decision I had avoided for weeks had arrived, not with quiet reflection, but with the roar of applause and the weight of 10,000 imaginary dollars. This was the last straw. The next words I spoke would change everything. The applause was still fading when I pushed back my chair. At first, no one noticed. Forks still scraped against porcelain, champagne fizzed in glasses, whispers of admiration floated across the tables. But when I stood all the way, my old back straightening with effort, the room stilled. I could feel 100 eyes turning toward me, some curious, some expectant. The host, surprised, quickly leaned forward and extended the microphone stand, as though he assumed this was part of the program. Michael's smile widened instantly. He clapped his hands together, urging the others on, his voice rising above the noise. "Yes, let's hear from my father. He's the reason I do what I do. No one deserves this moment more than him." The crowd erupted again, cheers, whistles, polite laughter. They thought they knew what was coming. They thought I would lift the microphone with trembling hands, my voice quivering with pride, and thank my son for his boundless generosity. They thought I would bless him in front of them all, completing the picture he had painted so carefully. The dutiful son, the grateful father, the perfect legacy. But I didn't move quickly. I walked slowly, deliberately through the space between tables. Each step echoed louder in my chest than it did on the carpet. I passed faces glowing with wine and wealth, faces turned toward me with indulgent smiles. They saw me not as I was, but as they wanted me to be. A man fattened by 10,000 invisible dollars, clothed in comfort I had never known. When I reached the front, the club manager held out the microphone. For a moment I didn't take it. I looked at it as though it were something fragile, something dangerous, because in truth it was both. Michael stood behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder like a guiding weight. His grip was firm, too firm, as if reminding me of my part in the play. "Go on, Dad," he whispered, just low enough for me to hear. "Say something nice." The words slid into my ear like a command. My chest tightened, my hands curled. I finally wrapped my fingers around the microphone. It was warm from the last man's touch, but it felt cold in my palm. I lifted it slowly, scanning the room. The lights above me were harsh, blinding, but beyond the glare I could see their faces, polite, eager. Waiting, they expected praise, they expected gratitude, they expected a father's blessing to crown a son's triumph. I took a breath, my throat dry, my heart pounding like it hadn't in years, and in that stillness I knew one thing. When I opened my mouth, I would not be giving them what they expected. The microphone hummed softly, like it too was waiting for my words. I looked out across the ballroom, rows of tables covered in white linen, plates half filled with lamb and salmon, glasses sparkling under chandeliers, men in tailored suits, women in gowns that shimmered like the night sky, all of them leaning forward, expectant, their faces soft with indulgence. They thought they were about to hear a father's blessing. Instead, I gave them my life. My son tells you. I began slowly, my voice gravelly with years of silence, that I live in comfort, that I receive $10,000 a month from him. A ripple of smiles spread across the room, nods, they believed they already knew the ending. I paused, my hand tightened around the microphone. But when I go home, I said, my voice sharpening, I open a refrigerator that holds nothing but a half-empty jug of water and a can of beans. The room shifted, glasses stilled in midair. Forks paused halfway to mouths. When I wake each evening, I continued, I put on the same pair of boots I've worn for 10 years. I drive an old Ford that coughs and groans just to start, and I spend my nights mopping the floors of a warehouse so that other people can walk into the morning on clean ground. Silence spread like a shadow crawling up the walls. I turned slightly, feeling Michael's hand lift from my shoulder, his grip gone stiff, his face tightening. I did not look at him, not yet. I've never seen those $10,000, I said flatly. My voice carried across the room, stronger now, no longer the whisper of an invisible man. Not $1, not 1 cent. The words dropped like stones into still water, and the ballroom went silent, not a heavy silence of boredom, but the brittle kind that comes when a truth slices through illusion. The band lowered their instruments. Waiters froze mid-step. Trays trembling in their hands, I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it, to feel the gap between the story they'd applauded and the life I had lived. I looked out at them, investors, neighbors, strangers who thought they knew me. Their eyes darted from me to Michael, then back again, searching for reassurance, for explanation, for some sign that this was all a mistake. But there was no mistake. I stand before you tonight, I said, softer now. But every word landing hard, not as a man pampered by wealth, but as a father who has been turned into a story that isn't true. And I will not let this lie breathe any longer. No one moved, no one clapped, no one laughed. The ballroom, so loud moments before, had collapsed into a silence so sharp it could cut glass, and for the first time in years I felt seen. At first there was only silence, a silence so deep that even the chandeliers seemed to stop shimmering. Then, like the first crack in a frozen lake, it began, a single murmur, sharp and disbelieving. What did he just say? Someone whispered. He never saw the money, another hissed. The whispers spread fast, like wind racing through dry grass. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and suddenly the applause of a few minutes ago felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Investors who had been smiling seconds earlier now leaned toward one another, brows furrowed, lips tight. The words $10,000 no longer sounded like generosity, it sounded like fraud. Across the room I saw Margaret Walsh, one of Michael's longest-standing partners, lower her glass slowly. She didn't blink, she just stared at my son as if she were seeing him for the first time. Michael's face, oh how quickly it changed. The easy charm, the practiced grin. The aura of control gone, his jaw clenched, his eyes darted from one table to the next, measuring the shift, sensing the collapse. And Sophia, she sat perfectly still, too still. Her smile had vanished, replaced with a mask of composure so stiff it was brittle. But her eyes, those calculating eyes, flickered just once, betraying the panic she was trying to contain. The questions grew louder now, no longer whispers. If he didn't get the money, where did it go? Was this a performance? Have we been lied to? One man, a silver-haired executive, pushed back his chair with a screech. He stood, pointing not at me but at Michael. You said your father was taken care of. You used those words as proof of your values. Were we all fools? The air was electric, charged with suspicion and anger. Investors exchanged glances not of camaraderie but of betrayal. Some reached for their phones, already typing, already sending messages. Deals built on image and trust were unraveling right there between the clink of abandoned glasses. I stood silently, holding the microphone at my side. I didn't need to say more, the room itself was speaking now. Every pair of eyes turned to Michael and Sophia, demanding answers without words. Michael tried to laugh, a hollow sound. My father, he must be confused. Numbers, arrangements, it's complicated. But no one laughed with him. Because the truth had already slipped into the room, and once truth arrives, it cannot be unseen. Sophia leaned close to him, whispering something quick, sharp, desperate. He adjusted his cufflink with trembling fingers, but his eyes betrayed him. He was cornered, and in that moment I realized it wasn't just me who had been invisible. It was their lie hidden in plain sight, and now in front of chandeliers and champagne that lie was cracking wide open. The ballroom wasn't just silent anymore, it was shifting, tilting, collapsing around the story they had built. And my son, my own flesh and blood, was standing in the center of the wreckage. The ballroom had been the stage, but the world outside, that was the audience I hadn't expected. It started with one phone, then another. Guests who had sat frozen in their seats now lifted their screens, recording quietly, almost instinctively, as if they knew they were witnessing a moment that would not stay in that gilded room. By midnight, the videos had left the chandeliers behind and landed in countless news feeds. The clips were grainy, shaky, taken from different corners of the room, but they all told the same story. An old man standing at a microphone, his voice steady, his words cutting through wealth and lies. I've never seen those $10,000, not $1, not 1 cent. By dawn, those words were everywhere. On Twitter, they trended under hashtags like #TheInvisibleFather, #10,000Lies, and #Truth at the Banquet. On Facebook, videos were shared with captions like "This broke my heart" and "Every parent deserves better than this." On TikTok, teenagers stitched clips with their own commentary, some mocking Michael's arrogance, others quietly crying as they thought of their own fathers working overtime. The story spread like fire, and fire once loose cannot be contained. Talk shows picked it up. Elder financial abuse, one anchor asked, or just the arrogance of the wealthy? Podcasts debated it. What does it say about our culture? One host mused. When appearances matter more than truth, when a man's love for his father can be reduced to a performance for applause. Even local radio stations replayed my words, my tired voice echoing through car speakers during morning traffic. And with each replay, the tide turned harder against Michael and Sophia. Investors began calling one another, pulling out of deals before the ink dried. Charity Sophia had courted released polite but firm statements distancing themselves from her. Photos once used to glamorize their life, the galas, the vacations, the perfect family portraits, were now reposted with captions dripping in scorn. One journalist wrote, "Last night in a room full of wealth, the poorest man, there was the only one who told the truth." Comments flooded in, not for them but for me, strangers who saw their own parents in my story. My dad worked 2 jobs and never once complained. Watching this broke me. I gave my mom $50 a week for groceries. I thought it wasn't enough. Now I realize some kids give nothing and still boast. This isn't just about money, it's about dignity, and this man deserves it. Sophia's carefully curated image, elegant, untouchable, crumbled overnight. Screenshots of her sharp glance at me circulated online with captions like, "The look that tried to silence him." And Michael, the golden son, the brilliant entrepreneur, was no longer admired. He was dissected, criticized, mocked. Every speech he had given about family values was replayed beside my words, exposing the hollow center. By morning, reporters camped outside his office. By noon, they were outside his house. And by evening, they were at my doorstep. For the first time in decades, I was no longer invisible. But visibility, I learned, is not gentle. It burns, it demands, it pulls you from shadows and forces you to stand where everyone can see. Still, as I sat by my small kitchen table, the hum of my refrigerator filling the silence, I felt something strange in my chest, not fear, not pride, relief, because the truth, once spoken, had finally grown louder than the lie. For men like Michael, reputation was currency, and in business, currency moves faster than truth. Within days of the video spreading, the first cracks appeared, not in the comments section, but in the balance sheets. Investors who once toasted him with vintage champagne were now calling their accountants at dawn. A rumor was one thing, but a father standing at a microphone, voice steady, telling the world he had never seen a dime, that was evidence, or at least the beginning of it. At the office tower where Michael's company logo gleamed in silver, whispers turned into meetings behind closed doors. One investor, Richard Hoffman, who had once written checks with a flourish of confidence, sent a terse email. Until financial clarity is provided, our partnership is suspended. Another, Margaret Walsh, the woman who had sat silently in the ballroom with her wine glass lowered, demanded immediate access to the company's books. Transparency, she wrote. Without it, we walk, and they weren't bluffing. By the end of that week, 2 major contracts had stalled. Wire transfers that once flowed like steady rivers froze midstream. Vendors called nervously, asking if payments would be delayed. Even the banks, always polite, always discreet, began to review accounts with more scrutiny than ever before. Sophia tried to control the narrative. She arranged private dinners, whispered reassurances, played the role of the elegant fixer. But charm is a weak shield against numbers, and the numbers, when examined, began to unravel. There were gaps, small at first, then gaping. Checks made out to entities that no one could quite trace, transfers that hopped from account to account before vanishing, spreadsheets labeled with vague titles, HB Support, Legacy Care, RB Credit. But when investors asked the simplest question, where is the $10,000? There was no clear answer. Michael deflected. It's complicated. Sophia deflected. He's old, he doesn't remember. But investors don't deal in deflections. They deal in paper, proof, and proof was missing. In boardrooms and conference calls, their names began to shift tones, from admiration to suspicion, from innovators to liabilities. It wasn't long before journalists caught wind of the financial discrepancies. Headlines moved from sympathy for me to scrutiny of them. Questions rise over Bell Holdings' financial transparency. Investors demand answers after viral father's speech. $10,000 lie, where did the money go? The storm was no longer just moral, it was financial. And in that storm, Michael and Sophia stood alone, trying to plug holes in a ship that was already sinking. The empire they had built on image and illusion was being weighed, audited, dissected, and for the first time it looked breakable. And all I had done was tell the truth. When a lie begins to crack, it doesn't break all at once. It fractures piece by piece as those who once held it together quietly let go. That's what happened next. It began with whispers from within Michael's own company. A junior accountant, nervous but resolute, reached out to a journalist. She described being asked to prepare 2 sets of ledgers, one polished for investors, one hidden in an encrypted file. She spoke of phantom transfers. Money rerouted through shell accounts before disappearing into names that no employee could identify. Then came the driver, an older man who had chauffeured Sophia for years. On local radio, his voice trembled as he admitted he had often been sent to banks with sealed envelopes. Cash withdrawals, he said quietly. Always in Sophia's name, always just before those investor dinners. The dominoes kept falling. A woman who had once cleaned their mansion told reporters how she often found unopened mail, bills, final notices, shoved into drawers while glossy magazines and charity invitations were proudly displayed on the marble counters. She remembered one winter evening when Michael boasted on television about buying his father a new car, while she had driven past the father's rusted Ford, broken down at the side of the road. Even old friends joined the chorus. Men who had once played golf with Michael began to admit they'd noticed things: extravagant expenses with no receipts, Sophia's sudden bursts of luxury shopping funded by accounts no one could explain. One by one, they distanced themselves. The loudest blow came from within his own boardroom. Alan Green, a longtime colleague, released a statement saying he could no longer remain complicit. He provided copies of emails, messages where Sophia referred to me as the useful prop and to the $10,000 as our cover story. That phrase, our cover story, lit the fuse. It was reprinted in newspapers, repeated on television, shared endlessly online. The narrative shifted again. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was deception, deliberate and cold, woven into the fabric of their business. The public outrage deepened. If once they had been symbols of ambition, now they were symbols of betrayal. Sophia tried to push back, calling the testimonies exaggerations from disgruntled people, but her words rang hollow because the faces of those speaking weren't strangers. They were insiders, the ones who had driven her car, kept her books, cleaned her floors. They had nothing to gain, but the weight lifted from their conscience. And as each story surfaced, a picture formed clearer than any press release. A house built on lies, collapsing plank by plank as those who once held it up refused to carry it anymore. For me, it was strange. I had lived invisible for so long, my truth dismissed as weakness. But now, others were standing with me, people I'd never met, people who owed me nothing. Their voices gave shape to mine, and in that chorus, Michael and Sophia's empire began to crumble, not from the outside, but from within. From the outside, their mansion still looked perfect, arched windows glowing, a manicured lawn trimmed with geometric precision, a fountain bubbling in the courtyard. But inside, the walls carried a different sound. Gone were the clinking glasses, the polite laughter, the endless rehearsals of charm. Now the halls echoed with slammed doors, hurried footsteps, and voices raised sharp enough to cut glass. Michael and Sophia had always been a team. Their lies braided so tightly they seemed seamless, but pressure reveals weak points, and under the glare of suspicion those braids began to unravel. One night neighbors reported hearing shouting that spilled out into the yard. Sophia's voice, sharp and furious, "You promised me this would never touch us. You said he would stay quiet." Michael's reply was muffled but full of rage. "I built all of this, don't you dare put this on me." Another evening. Their children, once paraded in glossy photos as proof of a perfect family, stood at the top of the staircase, whispering in confusion. They didn't understand why their parents, once so polished in public, now looked at each other with eyes filled not with love but with blame. At the dinner table, silence replaced conversation. Forks scraped plates, water glasses clinked, but no one spoke. Sophia's gaze stayed fixed on her phone, scrolling through endless articles. Each headline worse than the last. Michael chewed slowly, staring into the distance as though the food in his mouth was nothing more than ash. Even the house staff noticed the change. The cook quietly resigned, saying she didn't like the atmosphere. The driver avoided eye contact, his greetings clipped and cold. The mansion, once buzzing with movement, now felt hollow, grand but empty, like a stage after the curtains fall. And then came the whispers from within their extended family. The cousins, siblings, even Sophia's own mother began to question what's true, what's not. Invitations dwindled, calls went unanswered. The family dinners that once showcased wealth and unity were now reduced to silence and excuses. Michael, desperate, tried to convince them all that this was temporary. It's a misunderstanding, people will forget, they always do. But Sophia wasn't so sure. She had seen the headlines, the contracts canceled, the allies abandoning ship. And more than that, she had seen the look in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, of weakness. She no longer trusted him to steer them out of the storm. And so, late at night, when Michael sat in his study surrounded by unopened bills and legal letters, Sophia sat in another room, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low voice to contacts he didn't know about. The family unit, once their greatest weapon, was fracturing. Trust, already thin, was evaporating. And beneath the weight of silence and suspicion, the mansion itself seemed to sag. Like it knew it was sheltering a family that no longer existed. Michael and Sophia had set out to build a legacy. Instead, they were watching their house become a prison, each room echoing with the loneliness of two people trapped together, but already worlds apart. Rumors could be denied, headlines could be spun, but subpoenas, those pale envelopes with the seal of the court, cannot be ignored. It began quietly, almost clinically. A knock at Michael's glass office door, a man in a dark suit, badge glinting, asking for him by full name. Papers slid across the polished desk, their weight heavier than any contract Michael had ever signed. "Please review," the officer said simply. "You are required to comply." Sophia received hers at the mansion. The moment the envelope touched her hands, her carefully rehearsed smile faltered. She tore it open too fast, her manicured nails leaving small scratches across the paper. Inside, a summons for records, financial statements, personal correspondence. Every detail of the life they had constructed was now subject to inspection, and the inspectors wasted no time. Within days, Attorneys and investigators filled conference rooms with boxes of documents, bank records, wire transfers, copies of checks. They studied every signature, every decimal point, every line item. What had once been numbers that danced to Michael and Sophia's tune now became evidence, frozen and unforgiving. It didn't take long to spot the fractures. Transfers labeled HB Trust, but no trust existed in the banking system. Checks written with my name scribbled in the corner. But the handwriting wobbled as if someone had tried to dress in my skin. Emails between Sophia and a junior accountant with phrases like "under the threshold," "avoid audit," and "keep the parent support narrative consistent." The smoking gun came in the form of handwriting analysis. An expert compared signatures from my old driver's license, my employment records, and letters I had written decades ago with the so-called authorizations attached to Michael's accounts. The conclusion was chilling in its simplicity. The signatures were forged. Worse still, surveillance footage emerged. A camera at a Dallas bank showed a woman, Sophia, leaving with a folder at the exact time my signature authorized a large transfer. Standing beside her, not me, but a contractor later found to be a notary whose stamp had been used fraudulently. The evidence stacked higher and higher until even their own lawyers shifted uneasily in their chairs. Prosecutors began to circle. Words like elder financial abuse, forgery, fraudulent transfer appeared not just in newspapers, but in official documents stamped and filed. Meetings that Michael once commanded with charisma now turned into interrogations, his voice thin against the steady questions of attorneys who had heard every excuse before. Sophia tried to charm, to soften, to explain, but charm doesn't move ink on a page, and the ink was damning. In a single week, the empire they had polished for years no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the courts, to the prosecutors, to the judges who would weigh every lie against every scrap of evidence. And for me, the man who had once stood invisible in the corner, there was a strange, steadying truth. I no longer had to prove anything. The papers, the signatures, the numbers, they would speak for me now. The law had stepped in, and once the law takes hold, there is no more pretending. The courthouse was a fortress of stone and glass, but on that morning it felt more like a stage. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras blinking like restless eyes. Signs were raised, voices chanted, strangers debated in the chill of dawn. Some held posters calling for justice, others whispered about betrayal, but all of them were waiting for the story that had left the ballroom to finally meet the gavel. Inside, the air was taut, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The seal of the state loomed above the judge's bench, watching with cold authority. 12 jurors filed in, faces still as stone, yet every breath they drew seemed to carry the weight of history. And then the defendants entered, Michael in a dark suit that looked more like armor than clothing, his jaw locked, his eyes scanning the floor instead of the faces that once adored him. Sophia followed, her heels clicking against the tile, her chin high but her gaze unsteady. The world had seen her as untouchable once. Today her perfume could not mask the scent of fear. When they sat, the courtroom exhaled. All eyes turned to the man they had betrayed. Me, the clerk called my name. I rose slowly, my old knees stiff but steady. The oath tasted dry on my tongue, but when I swore to tell the truth, I meant every syllable. And so the trial began. The prosecutor wasted no time. He laid out exhibits one by one, each landing with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Bank records, transfers labeled HB Trust. Yet when asked, the bank manager testified, no such trust exists in our institution. Forgery analysis, a handwriting expert pointed to the curved tail of my last name, then to the flat, unnatural scrawl on the fraudulent forms. This signature, he declared, was not written by the same man. Surveillance footage, grainy video of Sophia leaving a Dallas branch with a folder under her arm the same day my authorization supposedly greenlit a transfer. The jurors leaned forward, some scribbled notes, internal emails, printouts glowing under the projector. Words highlighted in yellow, keep the parent support narrative consistent. Another, RB credit cover with optics. Each piece was a knife, slicing away the image Michael and Sophia had so carefully crafted. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecutor's voice was calm, measured. "Tell us," he said, "about the night at the club." And I did. I told them about the chandeliers, the laughter, the champagne. About Michael's toast, his words painting me as a father cushioned by luxury. And then my truth, the empty refrigerator, the rusted Ford, the warehouse floors that still carried my footsteps. The courtroom was silent except for my voice. Even the clicking of reporters' keyboards slowed as though no one wanted to break the rhythm of the story. Then came the hardest part, facing my son. Michael's lawyer rose. Sharp in his movements, his words crafted like traps. He asked if I was bitter. He asked if my memory was failing. He asked if perhaps in some way I had forgotten the money. I looked at Michael, my own flesh and blood, sitting stiff in his chair, his jaw quivering beneath his mask of control. And I said, I can forget where I parked a car. I can forget the name of a neighbor I met once, but I cannot forget a lifetime of mopping floors. I cannot forget the weight of an empty fridge, and I cannot forget money I never received. The words landed with a force no cross-examination could dull. For the first time, Michael looked up at me. Our eyes met. And in that brief collision, I saw not the man in a suit, not the son with a practiced smile, but the boy I had once carried on my shoulders. And I wondered if he saw me, not the witness, not the problem, but the father who had given everything, only to be turned into a prop. The prosecutor's final question was simple. Why speak now? I let the silence breathe before answering. Because truth doesn't belong in shadows, and if I don't speak, then my silence becomes part of the lie. The jurors wrote quickly. The judge's gavel tapped once. The trial had only just begun, but something had already shifted. The lie was no longer the loudest voice in the room. The truth had found its microphone. The courtroom had already endured hours of testimony, stacks of exhibits, and witnesses who had laid bare the machinery of deceit. But the moment that broke everything came quietly, just a single text message projected on the screen. The prosecutor adjusted his glasses, his voice measured but sharp as a blade. Mrs. Bell, he said, turning toward Sophia, can you confirm that this message was sent from your phone? On the screen glowed the words in stark black letters. Enlarged for the jury to see, your dad is finally useful. A ripple of murmurs surged through the courtroom. The jurors' eyes narrowed. Reporters' fingers flew across their keyboards. Even the judge leaned forward slightly as if to catch her reaction more closely. Sophia's hands trembled. She reached for a glass of water, but her fingers rattled the rim, betraying the mask of composure she had so carefully worn. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering frantically. But the microphone still picked up her shallow breath. Finally, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Yes, she whispered, louder this time when pressed again. Yes, I wrote it. The words landed like thunder. The prosecutor let the silence work for him, pacing slowly before turning back. And what did you mean by that? Sophia's lips parted, but no answer came. She glanced at Michael, her eyes pleading for rescue, but Michael sat frozen, jaw clenched. His gaze fixed on the defense table. He did not move. He did not speak. The prosecutor pressed harder. Did you mean that your father-in-law was useful as a tool for your deception, useful as a cover story for stolen funds, useful because his name carried more weight than your honesty ever could? Sophia's voice cracked. It was a mistake. I was angry that day. Angry, the prosecutor cut in, or proud. Proud that you and your husband could exploit the man who raised him. Proud that you had turned a father's dignity into a balance sheet. The defense objected, but the judge's gavel struck once firm. Overruled, the witness will answer. Sophia swallowed hard. For the first time, the elegance, the rehearsed charm, the carefully arranged mask, all of it fell away. Tears welled, but not the kind that soften hearts. These were tears of exposure. Of someone who realized the walls around her had collapsed. I didn't think it would ever come to this, she whispered. The prosecutor didn't need more. He turned toward the jury, voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just fraud. This is contempt for family, for trust, for love itself. When a daughter-in-law can write these words about a father who mops floors at night just to survive, what does that tell you about intent? The screen still glowed with the message, burning in every pair of eyes, and Michael, he sat motionless, no denial, no interruption, not even the faintest shake of his head, for a man who had always commanded the room. His silence was louder than any confession. The jurors saw it, the reporters saw it, I saw it, and in that silence the truth became undeniable. Their empire was gone, their legacy was ash, and the lie that had dressed itself in chandeliers and applause had finally collapsed under the weight of a single damning sentence. Your dad is finally useful. The trial was no longer about if, it was only about how far they would fall. The courtroom was silent, so silent that the shuffle of papers sounded like thunder. The judge, robed in black, sat with the stillness of stone, her voice measured, steady, unflinching. The jury foreperson rose, a folded paper trembling slightly in his hands. He cleared his throat and read, "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty." Each charge landed with the weight of a hammer. Elder financial abuse, guilty. Forgery, guilty. Fraud, guilty. The words struck not once, but again and again, echoing against the paneled walls, reverberating in every chest. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, jurors shifted as if relieved that their burden was finally lifted. Sophia gasped quietly, her composure shattered beyond repair. She slumped in her chair, lips parted as though trying to find a version of herself that could survive this. But there was none. Michael didn't move. His face was pale, his jaw locked. But his eyes, those eyes that once sparkled with ambition, looked hollow now. Not furious, not defiant, just empty. The judge spoke again, her words ringing with authority. "Sentencing will follow, but let the record show. The defendants exploited trust, violated law, and betrayed the very foundation of family. Justice requires nothing less than this verdict." Applause was not allowed in a courtroom, but the air itself seemed to sigh with release. Strangers who had followed every word of the trial wiped their eyes. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Finally," as though the verdict had healed not just me, but a wound in her own story, and me. I sat at the witness bench, hands folded in my lap, staring at the polished wood before me. Victory had been delivered, the truth had prevailed, but in my chest there was no celebration. I saw my son, head bowed. A man in chains long before the cuffs would ever touch his wrists. I thought of the boy who once clung to my leg at the park, the child who once flew a kite with me in the field. How had that boy become this man, this stranger? The gavel struck one final time. The trial was over. Lawyers gathered their papers. Reporters rushed to the steps. The world outside prepared headlines. Father wins, son falls. Justice for the invisible man. The $10. 000 lie ends in conviction. But as I stood, my knees stiff, my heart heavy, I whispered to myself words no reporter would write. I won, but I lost, for the law had given me justice. But justice cannot sew back together the threads of blood and love once torn apart. As the guards led Michael and Sophia away, I did not gloat. I did not even watch them leave. Instead, I turned toward the doors of the courtroom, toward the light spilling through the high windows. The world called it a victory. To me, it was the loneliest kind of truth, that sometimes justice comes at the cost of family. After the trial, I returned not to victory parties or interviews, but to my small apartment with its chipped mugs and creaking radiator. The cameras followed me for a while, then drifted away toward brighter headlines, but I knew the story was not finished, because stories like mine never belong to just one man. They belong to every parent who has ever gone unnoticed, to every worker whose name was signed on a time card but never in lights, to every elder who gave everything and was told they were worth nothing. And so I began to write, not legal documents, not sworn affidavits, but plain words in a notebook that had carried me through the darkest months. I wrote the story as it happened, the warehouse nights, the empty refrigerator, the ballroom lies, the trial where the truth finally found its microphone. But more than the facts, I wrote the meaning. When a community center invited me to speak, I carried that notebook with me. The room was not grand, a handful of folding chairs, a coffee urn at the back, a row of faces that looked tired but eager. People who had worked all their lives, people who had been told to stay quiet, people who knew the cost of shadows. I stood before them not as a man who had won a case, but as a father who had survived one. My voice was steady, but my heart ached with every word. I told them, love does not require poverty to make someone else look rich. Love is not measured in dollars or in applause. Love is sacrifice, yes, but sacrifice should never be turned into theater for profit. If someone performs care for you in public but denies it in private, that is not love. That is theft dressed in affection's clothing. The room was silent, not from disbelief, but from recognition. I saw it in their eyes, the nods, the wet lashes, the quiet exhalations of people who had lived some version of my story. I closed my notebook and said what had stayed with me from the first time I ever raised my voice. The doors are open now. Let the light do its work. No applause followed at first, only stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when words don't just enter ears but settle into bones. And then slowly the clapping began, not the reflexive applause of a ballroom, but the raw sound of gratitude. That night, someone filmed my talk on a phone and posted it online. By morning, the words had traveled farther than I ever could. Across states, across oceans, across screens where strangers whispered, "This is my father's story. This is my mother's story. This is mine." I never set out to go viral. I set out to survive, but sometimes survival itself becomes a message. And so my legacy is not wealth, not property, not even the justice stamped on court papers. My legacy is light, a light I pray will help others step out of silence, demand truth, and refuse to let shame be their inheritance. The story is not over. Stories like these never end. They ripple outward into kitchens, into boardrooms, into courtrooms still waiting for their moment of honesty. As for me, I will keep writing, I will keep speaking, and I will keep reminding anyone who will listen. You do not need permission to tell the truth. You do not need applause to be seen, and you do not need to wear poverty to make someone else look rich. The doors are open now. Let the light do its work. In the end, I did not win riches. I won something far more fragile and far more lasting, the truth. Love does not require poverty to make someone else look rich. The doors are open now. Let the light do its work. If this story touched you, share it. Leave your thoughts below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe, not for me, but for the reminder that family, in all its pain and beauty, is still the story that binds us all.